and welcome to the webinar today hosted by Trace. We are part of the Chartered Accountants Member Benefits Program, and we are partnering with Chartered Accountants ANZ to make sure that accountants and business advisors like yourself have the tools to be able to account for the carbon of your clients and the carbon of your firm. As I shared, I'm really keen for today to be interactive. So we have inbuilt a Slido interaction. If you have your phone available to you, you can actually just use the QR code here on the screen or go to slido.com and pop in that number there. What this will allow you to do is there are a couple of questions inbuilt into this presentation. It's also a way to type in any questions that you have for me throughout the presentation. So a little bit about myself. My name is Taylor Fox-Smith, and I lead up our partner program here at Trace. We partner with businesses who are interested in transforming the way they service their clients when it comes to financial and non-financial reporting. Trace's software is targeting carbon, and I think that it's that C word, carbon, which has really started to infiltrate the way we think about the accounting profession, but also the way we think about business, both here and abroad. All meetings that we do here at Trace, we start with an acknowledgement of country. I'm going to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which I am presenting to each of you today. So let's start with why, because for some of you, this might be the first time you're thinking about or hearing about carbon as a business risk that can be managed by you and your firm. What I've got up here is actually a quote direct from Chartered Accountants ANZ, which was written on their blog in June of this year. And I've just highlighted there that first sentence. The advice is clear, start early. And I think for the 180 members who have registered for today's webinar, you've clearly shown your intent to really start to learn about this space and think about the way that this might be an opportunity to not only strengthen your existing processes for a positive impact, but to strengthen your existing processes to generate revenue. And I think for me, that's something that that's a myth I'd really love to bust today, is that carbon accounting and being a sustainable leader in the accounting profession is not just talking about social license. It's not just about having a positive impact and mitigating the effects of climate change. If that's not quite your cup of tea, this is also a commercial opportunity. Carbon accounting is a way to generate a whole new stream of revenue and to future-proof your firm as we start to see risk management, corporate reporting, financial and non-financial obligations move in the way of climate. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to try and keep it really accessible, conversational, and hopefully with a whole heap of tidbits that you can take back now to your day-to-day business and think about the way you're going to integrate carbon into the way that you account. 3 parts. First section is going to be about going back to basics and really clarifying why your clients care about net zero. The second section is going to be about carbon as a business risk. So how is this regulatory landscape that we're functioning in shaping your profession? And then the third part is building your carbon accounting practice. So I want this to feel really practical, a session that you can not only hopefully build up your knowledge in climate and carbon accounting, but to also think about what does the next steps or the pathway look like for you being able to deliver this service. As you're all aware, being CAANZ members yourselves, there are exclusive benefits as part of that membership for working with Trace to kickstart that journey to being a carbon accountant. So our first section, back to basics and why your clients care about net zero. Let's just go to the term itself, net zero. What is it and why does it matter? It actually came about in 2015, which almost 10 years ago now. That was the Paris Agreement. And this marked a binding international agreement that states and non-state actors, so corporations and industry member bodies, would commit to net zero emissions by 2050 in order to prevent catastrophic global warming. Now, what this graph shows us here on the screen is that on the left-hand side, it's the state of being for a lot of businesses. They are measuring or have an understanding of where their carbon footprint comes from. And then in order to mitigate that carbon footprint, many businesses go down the path of offsetting. The real power of measuring or understanding carbon emissions is to be able to decrease them, or what we call decarbonize. And for many big businesses now, these net zero goals are implicating the small businesses in their supply chain. Big businesses can't decarbonize, can't manage their carbon emissions without asking all those small businesses in their supply chain to do the same. So the path to net zero starts with knowing where your emissions come from and how to reduce them. And that's really where Trace comes in. So we've been around for 3.5 years now, and we have built a methodology based on the GHG protocol that helps us to classify the organizational emissions of businesses within 3 scopes. And we use carbon measurement to power carbon reduction. You'll see here, I've just taken one small screen of a really cool platform that we have on offer for you today. And this screen here shows you what carbon footprint would look like for a pretty average small to medium enterprise here in Australia in a services-based industry. Now, when we think about measuring carbon, there is often the term of scope, and a lot of carbon footprints and carbon reports look at carbon emissions by scope. And there are 3 scopes that the GHG protocol defines when it comes to understanding the carbon footprint and the pathway to net zero for a business. The first is scope 3, and those are the emissions that are under the direct control of a business. So if you have company cars, the decisions that you make around how you refuel those cars is within your scope 1. Scope 2 are your indirect emissions, and they're predominantly the emissions from the electricity that you use and the gas that you use. So you have a little bit of control in terms of who you spend your money with, but not a lot of control when it comes to the grid itself. Scope 3 are all of the indirect emissions. So these are the supply chain emissions. And scope 3 is definitely the most interesting and definitely the opportunity when it comes to what accountants can do in carbon accounting, because these are the huge tail end of small to medium enterprises that live in a big corporate carbon footprint. And scope 3 is the hardest to decarbonize. So scope 3, accountants, you are in the scope 3 of many of your clients' carbon footprint. Now, a lot of this theory doesn't really make a lot of sense until we see it in the wild. So what I've put up here is just putting scope 3 and net zero into context. And having worked with over 100 accountants in Australia and New Zealand, I know that Coles is not the only big player who has reached out to their small to medium enterprises to produce a carbon report. So what I've got up here is Coles Group actually announced about 4 weeks ago now that they have new scope 3 emissions targets, and they are looking for their suppliers, 75% of their suppliers, to set emissions reduction targets. Now that is an incredibly ambitious target, and it includes hundreds, if not thousands of businesses to change the way that they do business. And who better placed to help small to medium enterprises measure and manage their emissions than accountants? Here at Trace, we know that accountants have been working in the P&L of small to medium enterprises for eons, and it is that same data that we use to measure carbon. So we've covered what is net zero, we've covered that measurement helps you decarbonize, and that big businesses are looking to measure their carbon footprint, decarbonize that footprint, and work in partnership with their scope 3 or their supply chain to do it. So the next thing I want to cover is what actually is carbon accounting and what is the relationship between that methodology and the practice of accounting that each of you do in your day-to-day already. So good news, carbon accounting formula is very simple. You'll see here up on the screen, it is kindergarten level arithmetic. The carbon emissions of a business are calculated with 2 data points. The first is an activity rate, which our accounting partners all surface for us from the P&L from a business, and that is multiplied by an emissions factor. That emissions factor is sometimes called a carbon coefficient, and that emissions factor is what is automated in our incredible software platform here at Trace. Not only that, but the activity rate, for example, it might be the dollar spend on advertising, or it might be the liters of fuel used to power your vehicles. That activity rate is multiplied by an emissions factor, all in a beautiful automated experience in our app. For many small businesses working with their accountant, it can be as swift as 30 minutes together, connecting a Xero file, mapping each of those line items to an emissions factor, and producing a carbon footprint. that can really change the way that your businesses are compliant in this changing and chaotic regulatory environment. So here at Trace, we really do believe that we are the best placed partner to provide carbon accounting services with and for your firm. You'll see on the left-hand side that we actually ingest data from Excel spreadsheets, from Xero. We can download CSVs from all other accounting software. And then our proprietary machine is able to create a carbon footprint that is compliant with any kind of reporting framework that a small to medium enterprise will be liable under in the coming changes under the ISSBs. Now, it's not easy to fit carbon accounting into 45 minutes, but what I'm hoping is to learn a little bit more about each of you and the way that you are thinking about carbon accounting in this current environment. As I said, we have worked with hundreds of accountants, but each of them are at a different stage of the journey when it comes to working with clients to solve the problem. I wonder if you could all pop open your Slido on your mobile device and give me a sense of what percentage of your clients have been asking about carbon accounting services. You'll see here that 1 is none. None of your clients are asking about it, and 5 is every single one of your clients. I am under no misguided expectation that we'll see anyone in the 100%. It would be amazing if they are. And I guess, what does it mean to ask about carbon accounting services? Have they asked about a carbon report? Have they asked about sustainability at your firm? I think anything around this climate and carbon conversation, if you could give a percentage as to how often you're hearing that, what I'm seeing on the screen matches my expectations. So this has not at all blown the plan out of the water. So we've had 38 people. We've got 81 on the call. I'll stop at 40 just so we can keep the momentum going. But it looks like, based on early results, we've got, wow, 2/3 of attendees here haven't heard or had the conversation with a client about carbon. And for me, that's not surprising for a few reasons. Is carbon is a business risk. The regulatory landscape is changing, but it is looking like the mandatory disclosure regime in Australia is likely to not be formalised until 2024. I think the misconception and the myth we'd love to bust with this idea that 2024 is when all of these changes need to take place is that in order to be prepared to produce a carbon report, each of you on this call will need to have a partner or a software provider or an emissions factor source base to be able to produce this service for your clients. Also, when it comes to carbon accounting, it's not something like a monthly reconciliation. A carbon footprint is more often than not an annual view of a business's carbon emissions based on their P&L. And it's really important that accountants and business advisors have the tools and the education to be able to have meaningful conversations with their clients as they start to navigate this changing regulatory landscape. So let's take a look at how we've gotten to this moment in time. How have we gotten to a moment in time where carbon reporting or carbon accounting generates interest from over 100 chartered accountants to join a webinar at 12 o'clock on a Thursday? There's obviously something in the air that's brought us all here. And I think if we look back even just at the last 10 months, we can see why. For all the attendees here today who are New Zealand based, you already know that you are functioning in a mandatory disclosure regime. Many Australian accountants may not know that in New Zealand, the climate-related disclosure regime came into effect in January. The ISSBs, another acronym. You'll learn that carbon accounting and climate reporting more generally is an alphabet soup. So bear with me with all the acronyms. The ISSBs were issued in June of this year, and they have set now a common baseline for climate-related reporting. We've had preliminary consultation here in Australia to develop our own climate-related disclosure regime. You'll maybe be aware that we actually had 2 rounds of consultation for that here in Australia and got some incredible feedback from private, public, and not-for-profit stakeholders on what it might look like here. And then finally, greenwashing. This remains a key focus for regulatory bodies in Australia, New Zealand, and abroad. And in a quick nutshell, greenwashing are misleading statements around the sustainability or climate-related action of a business. Again, having in place great carbon measurement solutions, whether it be Trace or another partner, enables you to protect clients from greenwashing, to give them the tools to transparently and with evidence talk about the steps that they are taking to be a more sustainable business. So 2023 in review, I didn't really get to touch on what's happening in the rest of the world. You'll see that there's a lot of momentum here in Australia and New Zealand, but all around the world, that momentum is 2 times as fast. At the time of presenting to you today, 27 countries have net zero legislation. Now, most net zero legislation enacted by states does remain focused on accountability functions such as disclosure and reporting. And those 27 countries include Canada, Chile, Germany, Denmark, Greece, Iceland, Austria. Notably, Switzerland, I've popped that actually here up on the screen, is the only country where net zero is now a legal requirement for all businesses. So that's pretty amazing. They had a referendum earlier this year and the people voted in favor of that. You'll see here a number of legislative regimes in the EU. The United Kingdom has a number of legislative regimes around energy efficiency. We're essentially looking to the Northern Hemisphere as a bit of a crystal ball for us around how is this going to manifest and what's going to come out in the water here in Australia. And I think what we're likely to see is the ISSBs, so these 2 rules as a common global baseline to be enacted in legislation here in Australia. But I will get into detail about that next. And that's because what used to be voluntary, and I think that's the key thing here and the key change that's happened in 2023 is we've got net zero legislation around the world. We've got preliminary consultations taking place in Australia. We've got mandatory regimes already in New Zealand, our closest neighbour. We're seeing this shift from voluntary reporting, i.e. carbon and climate. It's a nice to have. It might be associated with like green-minded folks. It's quickly becoming a mandatory requirement and quickly becoming a commercial license to operate. So it's no longer this social issue with charitable connotations. It's really now about how we all operate in a commercial environment. I think for me, one of my favorite lines is that if a business is not caught by legislation, they will absolutely be caught by implication. And I think what I mean by that is you'll see up here on the screen, I've actually downloaded one letter from some of the biggest multinational tech companies many of you may know, Atlassian, Okta, Salesforce. I'm sure many of us are actually using these softwares for our own businesses. These corporations have all asked for supplier reports. So what does that mean? Every single one of the small businesses in their supply chain has been asked to provide a report. And my guess would be that of the 90 or so people here on this call, you are servicing currently one of those businesses. So I've thrown a couple acronyms at you. I've thrown ISSB, I've thrown CRD, the mandatory reporting regime in New Zealand. I want to really take a moment to focus in on what are the ones we really care about, so that when you start to think about building your own carbon accounting business, whether it's creating measurement reports for your businesses or going as far as advisory services, do you have a little bit of a grasp on what these foundational acronyms are? There are 2 that I'd love you to walk away with having captured in the brain. The first is the TCFD. So the TCFD had 4 main pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. They all seem like corporate buzzwords. None of that really sticks in the brain, but it was launched the same year as the Paris Agreement. Governments pretty much unanimously aligned with the TCFD for voluntary reporting. In fact, in 2021, Australia was the 4th highest reporting jurisdiction for TCFD reports. Now, the TCFD has a publicly available database of what a TCFD aligned report looks like. And it essentially covers off on all the climate-related risks and opportunities for a business. Now, the TCFD was designed for the big end of town. They were designed for the Toyotas, for the Googles, for the Facebooks. They're not really designed for Bob's Bakery. It's not really designed for a local consulting firm. It's really targeting bigger businesses with larger carbon footprints and high emitting activities. But what we really want to focus on, and where the future of carbon reporting has gone, is under one of those 4 pillars, and it's the metrics and targets pillar. And this is hopefully going to link back to what we covered in the beginning of the session, which is around measuring, so we know how to decarbonize and produce a credible report. In the metrics and targets of TCFD, one of the core lines was to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and if appropriate, Scope 3 emissions. So we already have from 2015 this expectation that if businesses want to report on climate, want to report on carbon, Scopes 1, 2, and 3 will absolutely be part of it. In comes the ISSBs. And frankly, if there's anything that you take away from today, the ISSBs is probably the most important out of all the acronyms. And that's because the TCFD has actually now been incorporated with the ISSB. Again, showing us that we're moving into this really synthesized, simplified reporting framework where all we need to know now are these 2 ISSB rules. You'll see here up on the screen just how complex this ecosystem is of different reporting frameworks. As from 2015 now to 2023, we've navigated this murky water from voluntary reporting to mandatory reporting. So I hope you can see how I've tried to wade through all of that and bring up for you the TCFD was kind of the initial framework, and that set the scene for us to now launch the ISSBs, which are a standardized, internationally aligned reporting framework for business. So what do they look like? As I said, there's 2 of them, S1 and S2, and these are built on those 4 pillars of the TCFD. And you'll see there under section 2 that it includes Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So when your clients start to ask for carbon reports and they want to have carbon reports that are aligned to ISSB reporting frameworks, you want to be working with a partner who can automate for you the calculation of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which is thankfully something that our software can do for you and your clients. Here in Australia, as I said, we've gone through a consultation period. It's really boring. Lots of people write all these letters. It becomes really convoluted, all for us to essentially say that we ascend to those 2 rules from the ISSBs, which is climate risks and opportunities, Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are essentially what they're looking for businesses to report on. You'll see here up on the screen is a really great timeline, and I'm happy to share these slides and information with anyone on the call who's interested. This here shows how the standards and the policies will be developed in parallel, at which point ASIC will be able to regulate and guide how the legislation is then put in place. When this legislation comes into play, there are going to be 3, what do you want to call them, 3 phases of implementations. They're doing a staggered approach. And that staggered approach basically looks like ASX 100, ASX 200, ASX 300. So again, just like the TCFD, the ISSBs are going to be looking at the big end of town. We're going to ask, yep, no problem, can easily share the slides. They're going to be asking the AstraZenecas, they're going to be asking the Coles, they're going to be asking CommBank to put in place a report that talks about their Scope 1, 2, and 3 and their climate risks and opportunities. I hope in the last 26 minutes, the one thing that you've taken away in terms of Scope 1, 2, and 3 is that when a big business like Coles is asked to report on Scope 3, that implicates hundreds of small to medium enterprises. So let's bust the myth that this grouped or staggered approach to legislating mandatory disclosure doesn't implicate small business, because it well and truly does. This regime here well and truly implicates many of the clients of the practitioners that I'm speaking to today. And then in New Zealand, because I know that the attendees here today are not just from here in Australia, but also in New Zealand, where mandatory disclosures are well and truly part of the way that business operates. The timeline again, excuse me, in 2022, the External Reporting Board, in a similar way to what we're doing here in Australia, released climate standards. And those included the requirements for what should be disclosed in climate statements. Climate statements are again aligned to those TCFD pillars and have since ascended to the ISSBs. So again, you'll start to see that those acronyms start to flow off the tongue really easily once you start to understand the history of it. So the New Zealand's climate reporting disclosure regime applies to what they have termed climate reporting entities. And again, just like we saw on the previous slide, these regimes very much target the biggest businesses because they have the biggest footprint and therefore the biggest impact on how we reach net zero. So these CREs, these climate reporting entities, include large listed companies, banks, insurers, and you'll see that from January of this year, they have been asked to prepare an annual climate statement that aligns with the TCFD. And as you can see there at the bottom, adjusted for ISSBs as they are confirmed. I've got one little question, so you don't have to quite hear me talking throughout the whole 45 minutes we're together. It's more just a quiz, trivia. It's Thursday. There's a lot of trivia happening in pubs this evening, so I thought we'd take that in our stride. How many CREs or climate reporting entities do you think there are in New Zealand? I'll wait till we get to a respectable maybe 30, and then I'll click to the next slide. Oh, surely there's, it's 26. 4 more. Oh, maybe I've been ambitious. Maybe I've lost you all. 28. Oh, should I wait? 30, amazing. So yeah, we got it right. There are 200 CREs in New Zealand who are currently reporting. And again, just to really emphasize, that's 200 listed or big bank or big insurance companies who are reporting and who are looking to report on their scope 3. Now, I want to go back to the quiz that we ran, sorry, not the quiz, but the question that I asked right at the beginning of this call, which was that around 67% of attendees here today have heard nothing from their clients about carbon accounting. So 2/3 of you are not hearing anything. That doesn't negate the fact that we did have 1/3 who'd maybe heard a few rumblings. Maybe they have a very specific agricultural customer base, for example. But I thought we'd play a little game because we're on Google Meets. We get access to these amazing emojis at the bottom of your screen. I thought we might test, does your customer have one of these 4? A listed customer, a government contract, an agricultural product, or a social media strategy? And I thought maybe I could just get you all to click an emoji that resonates with you for what sort of customer you have. And I'm hoping what this visually represents for you is that even though you may not be hearing this from your clients, all of these emojis represent clients who will have to produce a report very, very soon. So all of those emojis represent potential opportunities for you to sell, create, and optimize a new service offering. Yay, thanks so much. That's so fun. Okay, part 3 of 3. Thank you all for bearing with me, and I'm so pleased to see all the questions that have come through. So I'll make sure we have plenty of time to answer those all together. The final part, and as I said, I really want to make sure today feels practical. The final part is about building your carbon accounting business. And each of you do have exclusive pathway options when it comes to partnering with Trace. Some of you may have seen Trace before we worked with Chartered Accountants ANZ. And that will be because we have actually been in the market working with accountants for all of this year. We are so fortunate to have now run 2 of our fellowships. And those fellowships are tailored 3-part programs to take practicing accountants, bookkeepers, and business advisors through a program that qualifies them to use Trace as a certified carbon accounting practitioner. Now you'll see on the left-hand side, I've grabbed a couple of the amazing LinkedIn testimonials that we've received from ASX-listed financial companies like Prime Financial, all the way through to small to medium-sized accounting practices here locally in Sydney. We work with a really diverse range of businesses and with individuals because, like I said, carbon accounting is a journey and we're all at a different stage. But we're really excited that you've all joined us here today because hopefully this is the beginning of us being able to work with, empower, and engage your team on that journey as well. So what does it look like? What are the benefits for you and your practice? I think at the beginning of this presentation, I was really keen to level set that there are probably 2 key reasons why this is an exciting opportunity for you. There is the obvious one around having a positive impact and playing your role in decarbonising our economy and challenging the really devastating effects of climate change with the skills that you have in your toolkit. The second one is really a commercial opportunity. Carbon accounting is the next frontier of service delivery for the accounting profession, and it is not only a way to generate a new and unique revenue stream, but the size of the carbon market itself is expected to be over 60 billion. So I think the opportunity now to be a first mover is one that's really exciting. The benefits for your practice working with Trace are that you get an exclusive discount off of measuring and managing your own firm's emissions. For many of our partners, they find working with Trace as a first port of call internally as the best way to learn how to build this service delivery yourself. This will include marketing support and assets to build your carbon accounting brand. You'll get dedicated support, and we have a software platform that is designed to fit in with the ways that you work. So we have a practice manager hub in the same way you work with Xero and other software platforms to make sure that you can get back to what you do best, which is servicing your clients with the tools that they need to be compliant in whatever way that makes sense for them. So I shared a little bit about fellowship. It is a 3-part training program, and for Chartered Accountants ANZ members, you will get completely discounted complimentary access to a fellowship. We're building a tailored 3-part program just for you. There will be no cost to you or your firm. That training program talks... Yeah, definitely, Igor. Thanks so much for asking. We can certainly share more information. The fellowship itself covers 3 sessions. So we do a really deep dive on the regulatory environment. As a lawyer myself, that is definitely like my area of expertise. I love getting into the weeds of what regulations are driving what changes. The second part of the fellowship is around methodology. I really synthesized carbon accounting in the beginning here with that simple arithmetic of an emissions factor multiplied by a line item in the P&L. There is so much more to the methodology, and it's a topic that we're really passionate about at Trace. It is what makes us different. It's our competitive advantage. It's our IP. The way that we calculate carbon and produce transparent reports to mitigate greenwashing is really a core part of our mission at Trace. And then finally, the third session is all about building your carbon business. So when we talk about marketing support, we're talking about how do we update your website? What sort of email communications can go out in your newsletter? How can we beef up your social media? I think when it comes to the fellowship, we want to be able to change the way you not only service your existing clients, but let's change the way you acquire new business. This is really going to be able to set you and your firm apart in this changing environment. And the fellowship is designed to give you the tools so that you can have meaningful conversations that generate revenue in the shortest amount of time. Before we close out, I want to really stick to the tune of being transparent. The climate and carbon space is all about giving businesses the tools to be open in their communications and transparent in the way that they operate. We, when it comes to partnering with accounting firms, make sure that you get the best possible pricing to go to market. We want to make sure that you're able to create a business model that delivers returns for your business, so that we can have a long-term fruitful, successful partnership. This information is something that we can share with you one-on-one if you're interested after today's session. But I hope, above all else, we were able to excite you about how you can start your carbon accounting business with Trace today. And at 37 minutes past 12, I think I'm just going to hold there and make some space for some of the questions that we've been asked. I'm very fortunate to have had, excuse me, my colleague Joel, who is our head of industry engagement, on both Slido and Google Meets Messenger. So I might just get him to help me navigate the questions. Okay, bear with me. All right, so we have a question in Slido. Does the client information provided to the accountant need to be audited, i.e. who checks if it's correct? Okay, really great question. So when it comes to the Trace platform, we integrate with the client's Xero file if they are on Xero, and where that client is not on Xero, we can take a CSV upload from another accounting software platform, be it MyOb or QuickBooks. That P&L information is what we use to do a spend-based analysis of the carbon emissions of that business. Spend-based makes up most of our measurement methodology, but it doesn't make up all of it. There is another methodology called activity-based. Now, I foreshadowed this at the beginning of the conversation when I talked about fuel. There are some line items on a P&L or some activities that a business undertakes, but it's much more accurate for a business to tell us that activity in non-dollar figures. So for example, we'd much rather know kilowatts of electricity used. We'd much rather know liters of fuel. We'd much rather know that instead of having spent $2,000 at Qantas, I'd rather knew you flew business class to Tokyo. There are just some activities that in order to get the most accurate measurement, we want to use an activity-based data set. Now, to the question around the accuracy of the data, having worked with accountants for a couple of months now, I know data accuracy is a challenge that we both face when it comes to working with businesses to produce reports. We have a checkbox when it comes to inputting that data, that it is the client's responsibility to make sure that that data is correct. But also remember that when it comes to carbon reporting and the regulatory frameworks that are in place, transparency is key. So when it comes to producing that carbon footprint report, the best thing you can do is talk about the data that you use to create that measurement. You can talk about, we didn't have liters of fuel, so we used a spend-based analysis for fuel. You can talk about that you had half of your staff working hybrid and you didn't have access to their electricity bills to be able to measure what the work from home footprint was. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to a state of perfect when it comes to carbon accounting, like a lot of reporting. But the way that we mitigate that and the way that we strive to get better and better is with transparent reporting of that data at the end. I have another question here. So a business can be sustainable / net zero, but at the weekends, the owners can effectively do what they want, fly around, drive V8s, and none of this is counted. Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. And I think we have to be able to draw a line between our corporate and personal responsibility when it comes to managing and mitigating our carbon footprint. There's a thing in carbon accounting methodologies called boundary setting. So at the beginning of a carbon measurement, you set the boundaries of the measurement. And when you measure a business's carbon footprint, it's what's called an organizational footprint. And that includes all the activities and operations of a business. Unfortunately, as we know, people have lives and activities and do things outside of the workplace that won't be counted in that calculation. I think what a carbon measurement can do when it comes to cultural and social changes, particularly in the way your employees or your leadership team might be able to learn from the process of a corporate or professional measurement, is they'll start to see the impact of their choices. You'll start to see for most small to medium enterprises, the biggest impact on their carbon footprint is the electricity that they use. And we often find that that empowers and inspires change in the workforce for those individual employees to go home and think about their own home electricity use. I see the conundrum, though, that people are in some ways, I guess, greenwashing their sustainable advocacy. by saying their business is super sustainable, but they have a private jet, and maybe they don't recycle any of their paper. But I think that what a measurement can do is it can really start to create behavioral change, because you start to see where the most emissions intensive activities come from.
And Taylor, I could probably add to that if you want, just for 20 seconds. There are other standards that are being introduced for things like vehicles. So the UK has a standard to phase out all fossil fuel powered vehicles by 2035. The EU has a policy with around the same time frame. So governments are certainly bringing in policies that do address some of the emission sources that question asked about. So driving V8s, for example, it might be a V8, but by 2035 it'll be electric. So it'll be quite different.
100%. I don't know who on this call has recently gone through a kitchen renovation, but I have, and it was way more cost efficient for us in the long term to get an electric stovetop. All of our appliances are now like 8 out of 8 stars in terms of the energy rating. And that for us was a financial decision. I obviously work for a climate technology business. I'm of the millennial generation who very much lean more towards sustainable choices. But at the end of the day, when it came to us doing this renovation, it was a commercial decision, and it was more green business was better business for us when it came to that kitchen reno. I've got a few more questions. I am cognizant that it's 12:43, and I'm a firm believer in the 45-minute mark being probably where people start to lose their attention. So I'll try and quick fire through these. Should climate summits be done remotely? Really good question. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions about what that means. Does remote mean more or less environmentally friendly? Should climate summits, or would climate summits have more impact if we were face to face? Short answer is I don't know. What I'm passionate about is having conversations that drive change. And I think we're in a working environment now where virtual is the best way for me to get my message across to as many people as possible in the most efficient, both time and cost way that I can. But it is interesting when you think about work from home and work in office. A lot of people are under the false impression that working from home is more energy efficient for a business or more carbon friendly for a business. That's actually not true. Going into the office is better for your carbon footprint. So for any leaders on this call who are trying to create maybe some more in-office culture, there may be a sustainability angle that you can take. And then the last one here, do you need to be a chartered accountant to be a carbon reporter? No, absolutely not. Chartered accountants are incredibly well placed to be able to produce carbon reports, given their proficiency in advisory services and also in the production of financial reports. But to be able to calculate carbon for a business and produce a report and support them in the implementation of decarbonisation, you simply need to have the gusto to be able to do a little bit of self-led learning. You need to have the ability and interest to talk about sometimes what might feel like complicated topics. And again, just being client focused and wanting to solve problems for your clients with the best solutions possible. What does your product look like? Yeah, really good question. I would love to show you all what the product looks like, but we're at 12:45. I would love anybody who wants to see the product to send me an email after today, and we can spend 15 minutes together going through it. Without being, actually, you know what? I'll do a quick little snippet of it while I've got it up here on my screen, so that you can all see what it looks and feels like for a small business. Let me bring it up. So it's a desktop portal. It's super intuitive for both sustainability professionals, accounting professionals, and people who come from neither background. We've designed it so that small businesses feel like there aren't barriers to action. We have a really simple calculation screen so that when you bring across your P&L, you can very quickly and easily map those line items to the emissions factor that's most relevant. With machine learning, our portal will be able to do most of that on its own. We also collect activity-based data. As I said, spend-based kind of gets you part of the way there. Activity-based makes sure that you're getting the most accurate measurement for the data that you have available. Once that data gets populated into a carbon footprint, you get a comprehensive and interactive breakdown of all the emission sources for your business. So everything from electricity usage to the way your employees get to work, and then also, of course, your supply chain. I used actually this screen grab in the presentation, and I think it tells the most beautiful story, which is that the two biggest components of this business's carbon footprint are from their supply chain, so their purchased goods and services, and from electricity. And you'll find for most of your SMEs, this is exactly what that footprint will do in terms of shaping their decarbonisation journey. And that's where our product, I think, goes into this really exciting next level of powering a carbon accounting business for each of you, because the money is in advisory services. Producing a report only gets you so far. The Trace platform powers you to take that report and actually do something with it for your clients. And what I've got here on the screen is our decarbonisation experience, which is interactive and tailored to each client based on their carbon footprint. But we can go into that in more detail when and if that makes sense for anyone who's interested. I think that's probably a good place for me to stop. There are a few questions here in the chat. How do you sign up for the fellowship? Really great question, Parvinder. Thanks so much for sharing. After today's session, I'll be sending an email out to each of you. The information in that email will be really quite simple. I'll share the slides from today's chat so you can get a little bit of time with them, have a think about the narrative that we shared today, some of the key touch points around what this opportunity looks like for your firm. I'll send my calendar as well so you can make time for me if and when you want to do a product demonstration. And we'll also send through a sign-up link for a fellowship for us to run. Depending on the numbers that we have, there are likely to be 2 fellowships run over the next 4 months. We go into this funny Christmas break period, so we want to make sure that those fellowship timings line up with people's availabilities. At 12:49, I think I'm going to call it there on the questions and everybody's time. Such a privilege to be able to talk about this topic, and I'm so thrilled by the numbers that we had here today. I really appreciate not only your questions, but your engagement in the slides, and hopefully what we have done is turn a curiosity into an intent to make moves. So my name is Taylor, and we are from Trace, and I can't wait to work with each of you into the future. Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye, 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 bye. Thanks, Van. Thanks, Bernard. Thanks, Nidhi. Bye. Bye, everyone.